Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. On Wednesday, 27th of October, Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced the UK government's latest spending review. So to discuss what that means and what it means for Wales, we are joined by Guto Ifan, researcher at Wales Fiscal Analysis team at Cardiff University's Wales Governance Centre. Hello, Guto.
Hello, Shmai.
Shmai. And Ed Poole, senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University. Hello, Ed.
Shmai, diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch. So before we get into the details, I think everyone who listens is aware of what the budget is, but obviously last week saw the spending review, which is slightly less well known. Can you tell us a little bit about what that process is and what it means, Ed?
Sure. So every few years, the Chancellor and the Treasury will put together a series of plans, departmental spending plans for the various departments of the UK government, which also has an impact on the spending levels of the devolved governments. So the spending review ideally would be over a few periods of a few years, so that's a way of giving a bit of security for the future shape of the budget. So the ministers and devolved government ministers, in our case, can have a relative degree of certainty over how much they might have to spend in the forthcoming years. Of course, with the coronavirus pandemic, these things have been much less able to plan. So we've seen 1 year spending reviews rather than that multi-year look that were originally the intention of these. But they're very important in setting the overall, what we might term the envelope of public spending for Wales. Because although it is true, of course, that devolved taxes, particularly devolved income tax, is making a big change to the way that the Welsh government is funded, still the vast majority of funding comes via the block grant. So Westminster government decisions are very important for Wales as well.
On the point about sort of certainty for the Welsh government, it's the first time that I think that the Welsh government have had that the Welsh government know how much they'll have to spend after the next financial year since about October 2017, I think, was the last time that they were able to set a multi-year budget. So that sort of uncertainty is pretty unprecedented, really, since we started having these spending reviews and the start of Gordon Brown's chancellorship. With New Labour, they brought in these spending reviews, but just having sort of 1 year spending reviews has just created a huge amount of uncertainty for the Welsh government, added to the sort of the billions and billions of pounds that have come on top of the allocated sort of core budgets for the COVID-19 response. Has been quite an unprecedented in terms of uncertainty for the Welsh budget.
Can I ask you about what you just said there, actually, Guto? So, one of the big takeaways in the media last week and from the UK government that in pure fiscal terms, it was a good day for Wales. There are billions more per year through to the 24-25 fiscal year. Is that right? Is that what happened last week?
Yeah, I guess it depends what your sort of benchmark is. I guess, that's often the case for these things. So if I take you back to sort of March 21, so last March, when the Chancellor announced his sort of indicative spending plans for the next 3 years, it was a really bleak outlook for the Welsh Government's budget. Basically, he'd cut back about £16 billion a year compared to what he was planning to spend on public services before the pandemic. So he'd taken his pre-pandemic spending plans and cut, despite the huge amount of pressures on public services. And wasn't. You could argue it wasn't really realistic, but you had to take, it was the only thing that we could go on. So back in April, when we were doing sort of our projections of the Welsh Government budget over the next Senedd term, it was quite a bleak picture, especially in 22-23 when the COVID-19 funding, so the one-off funding for public services was coming to an end. There wasn't a big increase at all in the sort of core day-to-day budget for the Welsh Government. And that would have led to, really difficult choices for the Welsh Government. We knew that last month he'd increased the health and social care levy, he brought in that. So we knew that spending would be increasing by around £600 million on top of those plans. What we weren't expecting was about another £1 billion next year in day-to-day spending and about quite significant amounts of funding for the previous 2 years. So spending now, if you exclude COVID-19 spending this year, the core Welsh Government budget will be growing substantially by around £2 billion, which is quite an enormous increase, and it'll stay flat really in real terms for the next 2 years. just lastly there, on that, in terms of your overall spending, will be falling next year because we've had the one-off sort of £2 billion, almost £3 billion of COVID-19 funding for this year. So that's been taken away. But now we've got some of that sort of additional COVID-19 spending will have to come from the core Welsh Government budget from now on.
Ed, I've got a question for you, but did you want to pick up on any of that?
No, I mean, obviously, I mean, from the headline numbers, there is a big increase, as you point out, and it's churlish not to recognise that there's some significant increases to the budget, and those are things that are really going to be needed because we know, particularly in the NHS, we've got this big backlog of cases as a result of the delays during the coronavirus pandemic. We've got relatively fewer beds available. There's last week the Western Mail noted the new data about beds availability. We've got a staffing crisis. So this funding is going to be needed, but it does allow these decisions to be made given these increases to the block grant.
One of the things in the budget speech, which I quite liked, was he kept referring back to the biggest increase since like 2010, and there's a theme there, and it is obviously, we've had a decade of austerity. I don't know if you did the work or have got a thought on where we would be with these budgets now if they were increasing over the last 10 years with economic growth and beginning of austerity. Where are we in that kind of vein, Ed?
Well, actually, I point to Guto on that because I think actually Guto has run the numbers in terms of, and also the fact that our population is higher than it was in 2010. So it spreads. There's more people of which to spread the budget around, if you like. But I don't know if Guto had the data on that one.
Yeah, so day-to-day spending next year will be about 9-10% higher than it was in 2010, which is a big change from sort of 4 years ago, when we were still about 8 to 6% below in real terms compared to 2010. On a per person basis, the population has grown by 4 to 5% in that time. So you're looking at about 5% higher than in 2010. But there's two things. I think you mentioned the sort of economic growth. If the budget had just stayed as a constant share of GDP over the last 10 years, I think the Welsh Government put it at about £3 billion higher it would have been. So that's one measure, I guess, of the impact of austerity on the budget. I think as well, it's important to point out that you've got the NHS spending since in England it's been increased in real terms throughout the last 10 years. In Wales since 2013-14, since that sort of U-turn of not protecting the NHS in Wales, and since then the NHS budget has grown by around a fifth almost in real terms. Obviously, that's an increasing share of a smaller pie or a pie that wasn't increasing. So as a share of spending, it's increased to almost half of day-to-day spending. And that's left everything else in the budget. So you've got about £5.7 billion this year of local government funding, of non-COVID funding for local governments. And you've got everything else in the budget, which is about 3.1 billion. So your housing, transport, all sorts of things, further and higher education, etc. That and local government is still about 10% below where we were in 2010, which is a significant cut. Over a 10-year period, it's been squeezed.
So on paper, we're in a good place. I think it's fair to say. Can we say then that this is the end of austerity in its current format?
It's a difficult one, because on the one hand, we've got this big increase in the block grant, but the real problem with austerity is it strips out capacity in services, which then takes a huge amount of time to build back up. So when we had the reduction relative to English spending in the health department early in the last decade, and we've had continuous that particular period of austerity, it means that right from the start, it's been very difficult to catch up, right? So particularly in the health service is a really good example, because it takes probably a decade to get up to a level of capacity that you need. It goes right back to the number of medical school places that are available, that there's a real shortage compared with the numbers that are needed in terms of increased demand in the future. There's far fewer places than we want. We have a relatively smaller number of beds than we would have had the budget not been increasing in line with what was needed at the time. And of course, we've got aging populations with long-term illnesses, obesity, advances in genomics. We've got new technologies, all of these things that have put huge pressure on the health service, notwithstanding the coronavirus pandemic. That means that the impact of austerity is a long-term one. So it reverses to cash, while important, don't really erase that damage.
I found it really interesting how the Chancellor said that he made a big point about that we're bringing education spending in England, per pupil spending in England on schools back up to 2010 levels, and that's sort of in 3 years' time. So that's sort of 15 years without any growth in spending per pupil, and somehow that's a sort of an achievement of the government. It tells you a lot about what's happened to spending over the last 15 years, but also tells you something about sort of how this UK government is almost running against, or trying to run against the policies of George Osborne. So they are trying to position themselves against the austerity policies of George Osborne. I think, as I mentioned, the sort of NHS spending versus everything else just now, as Ed said, NHS spending growth hasn't been sort of particularly high from a historic perspective. And outside of health spending even over the next 3 years, we're not going to get back to 2010 levels at all. Obviously, those services have an impact on health services as well. So yeah, it's sort of an end to austerity policies, but it's certainly not a reversal of austerity.
And just to add to that, I mean, and Guto talked about the kind of running against George Osborne's politics, which of course is true, but it's much broader than that, because now we've got an international consensus that austerity was the wrong way to go after the credit crunch and the subsequent financial from the subsequent recession. So we've got the international organisations arguing that this kind of more deficit funded spending is a better way to go. We've got big increases in the federal spending in the US. We've got other parts of Europe increasing spending, and of course what they're doing in the UK government on this front as well. So we've got a different set of circumstances, I think, recognising on a global perspective what austerity caused. So yeah, the UK is pushing at the kind of global tide on that one.
So with spend often comes tax. What kind of taxation changes are we going to see to pay for this increase in spending, Guto?
Yeah, so you've got the Chancellor's new fiscal rules that he set himself. So he says that he wants a current budget balance over a 3-year period. So that means that he doesn't borrow for anything other than investment spending. So it means that taxes have to rise above current spending on day-to-day services, which has increased a lot. So if you look at the tax to GDP ratio, so it's a measure of sort of how much taxation compared to the level of the economy that the Chancellor plans to raise in taxes, that's going up from 33% 2 years ago to 36%. It's been hovering around 33%. It doesn't sound a lot, but it's been hovering around 33% for this century at least. And then if you go further back in time, going up to 36% of GDP raising in taxes is the highest ever sustained level. You have to go back to the 50s to see a similar tax to GDP ratio in the UK. So obviously he's increased since becoming Chancellor. He's increased corporation tax, or he reversed some of the planned cuts in corporation tax, and increased the headline rate of corporation tax. He's frozen income tax thresholds and brought in the health and social care levy. It's interesting, we're looking at this week in terms of where this places the UK in an international context. So the UK is a low tax economy. So its tax to GDP ratio is below the OECD average currently. And if they manage to increase tax to GDP ratio up to 36%, that brings the ratio above the average for developed countries, and it's broadly in line with the other major economies, the G7 economies. But it's still significantly below Scandinavia, the average for most other European countries. Yeah, so it is sort of almost a catch-up, a partial catch-up to some of these countries that have much higher tax to GDP ratios. But, that's the forecast. But obviously that you heard towards the end of the Chancellor's speech that that's not his goal. He wants to see taxes coming down before the end of the Parliament. So I think there's the reasons to doubt whether he'll actually follow through with this, with the proposed or forecast increase in the tax to GDP ratio.
Following that up, I've kind of got two questions. Have you done any work with regards to what this means in real terms to people's sort of pay packets, these increases? And also, what sort of measures would the Chancellor have to use in order to be able to lower taxes by the end of the parliamentary term?
So he's sort of relying almost on the forecasts being better. I don't think there's any room for reining back spending. It's a question of if you want to cut back spending, what would you cut that George Osborne didn't cut 5 years ago? He's sort of relying on, he's got some headroom, as they call it, against his fiscal target of a current budget balance. So either he breaks his fiscal targets, which I don't think would be the worst thing, or he's relying on a sort of uptick in GDP over the next few years, which I don't know how likely that is either.
Yeah, and I think it's just very difficult to, given the pressures on particularly the NHS and social care, that I think that cutting taxes significantly would be quite difficult in this environment. We already know that the vast majority for the first 3 years of this new health and social care levy will actually be going to the health service. So we've still unfunded a lot of the demand on social care. The social care plan that Boris Johnson announced was more to do with limiting how much individuals would have to put into covering the cost of their own social care rather than actually funding those additional costs. So there's so much unfunded liabilities, if you like, still out there that I think that cutting taxes, as Guto said, would probably be reliant on a very significant uptick in the economy and the associated benefit to the Treasury's coffers. And they could do some circumstantial changes that look like that there's tax cuts, but in the grand scheme of the big picture, like the percentage of the economy, the tax rate, those things I think are going to be very difficult for them to cut.
One of the ones which did surprise me, and I like your take on it, was the cut in air passenger duty for short-haul domestic flights. Brilliant entry to COP26. I thought that was promoting one of the worst carbon emitters, climate change aspects. So that was one. I don't know if you've got any take on that. But also, were there any other, because one of the things with the budget is, and I'm someone who's worked on budget day and had to go through it line by line, was there anything else which might not have appeared in the news which has surprised you, whether it be a tax cut or a tax hike?
On air passenger duty, I mean, I think it was just a really unnecessary thing for the government to have done. This is in the context where fuel duty was frozen yet again. We have everybody who travels on a train, particularly long distance, knows how extortionate rail fares are in the UK. And instead of doing something on that front, where of course we're bringing back railways into some type of closer public ownership with this Great British Railways plan that has been announced. There's a lot of franchises now back in the direct running of the Department for Transport, and of course Transport for Wales being government run. We've got so many opportunities now to use public funds to actually support a climate-friendly transport system. We know what we can do in that area. We can electrify the railway, which reduces our carbon emissions on these bi-mode trains that turn off the power in Cardiff and run to Swansea on diesel, pumping carbon into the atmosphere. We can reduce fares. We can improve the decarbonisation agenda quite not easily, but we know that transport is one of the biggest emitters in terms of the carbon footprint and carbon emissions. So for the government to not only freeze fuel duty, but to not encourage people to go back to using public transport after the coronavirus pandemic, and then to go the other way in cutting domestic flight taxes when France is abolishing domestic flights where the TGV network can take the strain of that. It just beggars belief. And it really, when the government is doing actually quite a lot on the climate front, having quite an aggressive net zero plan and trying to persuade other countries around the world to join suit in having quite an aggressive decarbonisation strategy for them to do this, it just absolutely beggars belief. And it did take away from actually some of the good things, not only on the budget side, we talked about the increases to the block grant, but in the overall package that the government is putting forward at COP26. There's of course certain cases with the Scottish Islands, for example, where you'd need to subsidise flights because they might be the only option. But that's not the case for an EasyJet flight between London and Manchester or London and Glasgow, where a train can easily take over. So it was just one of those areas where you just really look at it and think that was unnecessary own goal, if you like.
Yeah, I just thought there might have been some really good lobbying going on somewhere along that line. Guto, did you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I guess just to reiterate the fact that I don't think he mentioned the climate at all during his speech, and considering it's sort of a defining issue at the moment, it's quite shocking. In terms of, I think it's interesting, looking at the capital budget side of the Welsh Government's budget, so the budget for sort of infrastructure spending and capital projects, that's actually going to fall over the next couple of years in real terms. So we've seen quite a big increase, a relatively big increase over the recent years, but it's going to be sustained at that level and it's not going to grow over time past the sort of £2.5 billion mark, which at the time of you want the Welsh Government now spending, so there's infrastructure spending to reach net zero that the Welsh Government needs to be doing. It's not ideal that the budget, the capital budget isn't growing. I think that might be where the squeeze is in terms of the tough decisions for the Welsh Government would be. They'll have the certainty of the next 3 years, and they'll know for once, they'll know what their capital budget, or have reasonable certainty of how much they've got to spend, but sort of balancing the different demands on the capital budget will be difficult over the next 3 years.
Can I ask you quickly, Guto? I think you've got to work in the environment with these financials to get the different terminology. I think capital and revenue often get people. Can you give a quick summary on the differences on that, how it impacts these decisions? Yeah,
sure. So it's not an arbitrary. It's sort of an accounting difference between how you class different two types of spending. So first of all, you've got revenue or resource funding. I often call it sort of day-to-day spending on public services. It's paying grants or paying procurement. It's paying with the wages of people who work for the NHS or local governments, with contrast with capital spending, which creates assets or creates either physical or other financial assets. So, for instance, building a road or a building or sort of infrastructure that usually creates and has sort of a long-term value. I think that's the best way of describing the difference between the two. And I think sometimes, and this sort of distinction between the two does matter for government's fiscal rules. So in the Chancellor's fiscal rules, he wants, as I said, he wants the sort of a current budget balance. So no borrowing for investment spending, and that investment spending then capped at 3% of GDP. So that sort of gives him the targets for both that types of spending. And I think sometimes it's quite an arbitrary distinction, because you spend day-to-day spending on schools is arguably good for the longer term prospects of the economy. So and that's classed as day-to-day spending, even though that it does create human capital, if you like, to put it crudely. Which sometimes the distinction isn't really that helpful.
We're going to move on a little bit to the shared prosperity and levelling up funds. The Chancellor reaffirmed his commitment in the spending review to Wales receiving not a penny less than it would have done under EU schemes. What's the reality of the situation, Ed?
Well, so far that's not the reality in terms of the connection between not a penny less and the amount of funding through the Levelling Up Fund and the Community Renewal Fund. I mean, the eve of spending, it was about 375 million per year under the old arrangements, and was particularly targeted, of course, in West Wales and the valleys, which was the area of greatest need. Whereas at the moment, we've got Wales receiving 46 million from the Community Renewal Fund in the past week. And that is the pilot scheme for their Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the long-trailed scheme that would be eventually expected to at least match EU funding. So at the moment, we have this pilot scheme, which is kind of providing funds for individual projects that have been chosen by the Westminster government. It is not at the moment the replacement for the amount of funds that were being received by Wales. There's a lot of questions about whether or not they're including the running down of the last couple of years of the structural funds. But this at the moment we were in pilot territory on that one.
On the Shared Prosperity Fund, I think over the next 3 years, I think they use the term they'll ramp up spending to £1.5 billion, which I think overall in the UK matches the receipts that the UK got on average from the EU, from the infrastructure funds, but that's in nominal terms. So I guess in 3 years' time, that £1.5 billion will be worth less than EU infrastructure funds to begin with. And I guess then it becomes a question of how much the Welsh share of that, what the Welsh share of that is. You'd have to have around a quarter of it to be in the right ballpark in terms of what we got from the EU. In nominal terms, that is, not in real terms. You'd have to have much more, but it's roughly our share of the £200 million pilot. So maybe eventually, if we maintain that share, it'll be not a penny less, maybe. But it's quite uncertain there. I think Ed mentioned that the fact that EU funds are still being distributed this year. I took a look yesterday morning at the sort of the committed funds, so that the EU funding worked in 6-year funding rounds. So Wales was allocated a pot of money essentially to spend from 2014 to 2020 under the EU's infrastructure spending programs or funds. And I think there is quite a lot of that, about £800 million of that might be coming over the next few years if it's distributed after that period has come to an end, but some of it is sort of reimbursed for the projects after they've already spent money. And I think, I might be wrong in that those payments will still be coming until 2023, when they will be sort of have to shut down. Because even though that we might not be getting a penny less, if we manage to get a big share of the Shared Prosperity Fund, it is controlled, or it's looking like it'll be controlled by the UK government. It'll be on a sort of a competitive bids basis from local authorities in Wales bidding for this funding. My chief concern is just in terms of governance, and a lot of the EU funding funded Wales-wide skills programs, for example, which doesn't fit neatly with something that where you have local authorities bidding against each other for individual funding. So you might have sort of 22 different programs running it simultaneously, doing similar things. So there's a lot of room for waste, I think. And I guess going back to the Levelling Up Fund, which is a separate pot, which is not EU replacement funding, and Wales is getting slightly higher share than its population share from that. So the £121 million that we heard in the budget, that's pretty sort of randomly distributed projects coming in. Sort of the Tredegar Queen Hall, is it, that got funding? And then you've got the Community Ownership Fund that's funding a community pub in North Wales. So there's all these different projects being funded from different pots, and you've got civil servants, central government civil servants deciding on things that I don't think should even be decided on a Wales level. It should be decided by local authorities themselves if a community pub in North Wales gets funding. So I think and sort of the from the Levelling Up Fund, you've got a 1.5 kilometre road in from the Rhondda to Cardiff being funded, which so you've now got 3 tiers of governments spending money in similar areas. So in terms of governance, it's a bit of a mess, and it's no real overall plan. I guess it's just these ad hoc investments being made. So that's my rant over.
The budget does see quite a significant increase, like you said, in UK government spending in devolved areas. What does this new approach tell us, Ed?
Well, it tells us they are intending to spend money directly over the heads of the Welsh Government in devolved policy areas. I mean, we've seen there's an increase of 40% in the budget for the Office of the Secretary of State for Wales in the budget. It's a relatively small amount of money, I think £6 million, but still signifies the kind of direction of travel on this. The idea that they would strengthen and sustain the Union and Wales' role with it, and increase the visibility of the UK government's commitment to Wales being the priorities for that spending. So it's very clear what the intentions are here. I think what is very concerning from a governance and transparency perspective is that when politicians or interest groups or civil society ask for the methodologies about why certain areas are selected or not selected for priority funding, why particular projects are awarded funding and not, the answer comes there none too often. I think we're slipping back in terms of transparency from a situation that was not great in terms of the distribution of the EU funds at the Wales level, but we're going in reverse in terms of transparency and governance arrangements. And by doing this, the UK government opens itself to accusations from political opponents that it is using these funds for political purposes. It's just very difficult if you don't have methodologies very clearly laid out on this, it opens themselves to criticisms about transparency and governance issues.
I've been quite lucky to work on budget day in central government, and it is a really interesting day. It is really exciting. There's pressure, there's stress, but if you enjoy that side of things in the politics, it can be quite good. I think I know the answer to this, but where do you think the Welsh government, Scottish government, Northern Ireland is in the process of budget setting at a UK level? Do you think there's any involvement at all, or do you think there's a deliberate arm's length approach and the lack of clarity from the Treasury until the very last minute is a deliberate, or is it just something which has developed?
Well, it's difficult to know, not being on the inside, right? Because you can only respond to what we see as lay observers of this process. We don't know what ministerial discussions are like between the Treasury and the Welsh Government. I mean, I do think in the cases, some of the more egregious areas are the overnight decisions over tax rate changes that have a direct implication on the policy of the Welsh Government. So where the stamp duty holiday was introduced for England, of course, it's a devolved tax in Wales and Scotland. Overnight, the Welsh ministers have to decide on what to do about the land transaction tax and the land and buildings transaction tax in Scotland, without any notice that these big changes are coming. So I think there is much more that can be done on providing notice. Of course, having the spending rule, the multi-year certainty this time around is very useful for budget setters at the Welsh level, but I think that a lot more can be done. I think committees all over the UK and in the devolved countries will have been pushing this matter for years, that there needs to be more collaboration and communication and coordination of given the intergovernmental connections over the public finances in the UK. But given the political pressures, I don't think we've seen that get anywhere near as far as we'd like.
Guto, we saw yesterday the Bank of England keeping interest rates at 0.1%, but there was a caveat there. There was a warning that they would have to increase soon to deal with the looming threat of up to 5% of inflation. What sort of impact do you expect that to have on the cost of living, and what would you expect the various governments of the UK to do to tackle that threat?
Yeah, so in terms of the cost of living crisis, as I mentioned, it was a good budget for departmental spending, but it wasn't much in terms of tackling the cost of living crisis. You've had an important change in universal credit, the change in the taper rate and on how much universal credit recipients can work, or how much of additional income that they can keep as they work more hours. But that's not nearly enough to sort of compensate the fact that there was a cut, the removal of the £20 uplift to universal credit that we saw. So people, especially on lower incomes, will be squeezed by that decision. And these are households that spend a lot on energy, where the price pressures are probably highest as a share of their income. They spend a lot on these areas that they're seeing sort of big price increases. So in terms of what the UK government did, I don't think it did too much on that, and I think the Chancellor could have gone much further. In terms of the Bank of England announcement of I think it would have been a mistake to increase interest rates. I don't think the economy is particularly strong at the moment, so I don't think, even though it's sort of where unemployment might not be as high as we'd have expected or forecast before, going back to March, on the March forecast, the OBR forecast that unemployment would go up to sort of 6.5%, I think, but it's now 5.2%. In Wales, that's about 17,000 fewer unemployed people compared to what they were expecting back in March. So the outlook is better, but the GDP is still below where we were before the pandemic, slightly closer to where we were before the pandemic than was forecast, but we're still below. So I think now is not the time to sort of for tightening. And I think, again, I guess on that point, I think I mentioned the sort of fiscal rules earlier, that the UK government have these fiscal rules that want the current budget balance over 3 years. There's a sort of a get-out clause of that when there's a significant negative shock. And that's sensible, because if there's an economic shock like we've had in the last 2 years, it's going to blow fiscal targets out the water. It's going to increase spending and lower revenues. But that sort of get-out clause from the fiscal rules aren't sort of defined precisely. And I think we probably still are in a negative shock. And I don't think we should be having these fiscal targets now at the moment, because we're still in this sort of dip, if you like. We're still below where the economy was. We're still far below where the economy would have been in the absence of the pandemic. So now is the time almost for fiscal stimulus, which we're not getting. We're getting sort of a removal of this fiscal stimulus probably a bit too early. So an interest rate rise on top of that would have been bad news, I think.
Part of the problem, of course, if you're the Bank of England or Monetary Policy Committee, you're seeing, as Guto says, all of these difficult pressures on the public finances. But you're also seeing, on the other hand, very significant inflation forecast on the horizon. So the OBR at the time of the budget, they're forecasting that the consumer price inflation is set to peak at 4.4% in the second quarter of next year. And this is way above their historical target, for which they'd be wanting to set interest rate policy around. We've got energy price inflation that is creating this big squeeze on household incomes. So in the traditional way of approaching these kind of inflationary environment would be to increase interest rates. But as Guto says, there's a huge prevailing currents against those types of rises. So they're in a real quandary. These kind of questions about things like stagflation and all of those old economics terms. Anybody who did A-level economics or back in high school would be familiar with these difficult challenges for policymakers. And the Bank of England's a real quandary on this one, because the traditional policy tools to respond to rapidly growing inflation, there's pretty big reasons not to use them in this current environment. We talked about energy prices and universal credit. With the latest Resolution Foundation report, says that in this Parliament, they're expecting the weakest annual growth in disposable household income since records began. So just 0.1% or possibly zero. Add in NHS waiting lists, the energy price inflation, and the hit, particularly on lowest income households, of energy cost increases. raising interest rates with the associate pressure on mortgage rates and credit card debt is not something the bank will want to do easily.
What did you think of what Andrew Bailey said at the start of this week, kind of inferring an interest rate rise and how the markets took that? How do you think that's left his credibility?
I have nothing but sympathy for his position for the reasons I outlined. This is a really difficult decision that this policy committee is having to make. The use or the lack of use of these tools, it comes with really, really, really big consequences. And they'll be under pressure from the government, from the markets to try and get inflation down, but they're under political pressure to not compound this household squeeze. It's a really difficult situation, and I think the markets will be, as they do, responding kind of jittery to any kind of indication that there'll be the fiscal hardship along the way. But it's always a tough job at the best of times being bank governor, but this is a particularly tough one, I think.
So before we go, let's have a little bit holistic question. What is your sort of long-term outlook for the Welsh economy, Guto?
Big question.
Do you mean long-term as in the next 800 years?
It's a little bit less.
Like the Welsh budget's coming up. We mentioned it's a Christmas gift. Take it from that and into the rest of this Senate term.
Drink.
Yeah. So in terms of the longer term prospects, I guess big story of the last sort of 15 years in terms of economic growth is just how sluggish economic growth has been. In terms of the sort of GDP per person, that's set to be only like 10% higher in real terms in 2004 compared to what it was in 2008. Had sort of trends pre the financial crisis trends had continued over that period. GDP per capita would be a quarter higher than it is or will be in 2024. And I mentioned earlier that the sort of tax to GDP ratio, that's an awful amount, a lot of lost tax revenues. And personally, I don't think that there's a longer term growth strategy or a sort of a plan for economic growth. And that's what's sort of missing in the UK government's plans. And in terms of the likelihood of the Wales specifically sort of seeing higher growth in the rest of the UK or sort of catching up, I think it's not particularly likely. I don't think that the UK government is serious about levelling up productivity across different parts of the UK. I was looking earlier this week I was reading a book by a Cardiff Business School economist called Leon Guberman about the history of the economy and government in Wales since the Depression. He talks about the Special Areas Act of 1934, which was the first attempt at regional policy, I think, in the world, because of the impact of the Depression on particularly South Wales.
That was why I did that in my undergraduate degree.
Yeah, so and yeah, I think Elaine and Bevan called it a sort of an empty and idle, attempt at doing nothing. I think it was his words, but it was widely seen as ineffective. And spending for that per year was about £2 million, which compared to the size of the economy at the time was about 0.05% of GDP. And I was looking at comparing it to the Shared Prosperity Fund once the funding will be ramped up, as they say, by 2024. That £1.5 billion will be the same share, or 0.05% of the economy. So in 2024. So these investments, so these ad hoc investments that I mentioned earlier, are not going to sort of transform the relative position of the Welsh economy, particularly because they're not even going further than what we had under the EU for the last 20 years either.
I think from a budgetary perspective, it's a lot better than it was six months ago in terms of if you were the finance minister of Wales and looking at what you're going to budget on health service and so on. We're coming through this particular crisis where there's been an enormous, historically enormous amount of money transferred into the Welsh budget to deal with the consequences of COVID. And as we ramp out of that, the picture is not as bad as it could have been in terms of what we would ramp back down to in terms of our budget. Now, of course, the problem is we've got enormous pressures, particularly on the health and social care side. where we've got exhausted medics who've worked for 18 months through this pandemic. We've got catching up with an aging population, with new technologies, with new medications, with new health problems that cost the NHS a lot of money. So that we can never really get ahead of those problems. So we'll be here in future years saying that there's pressures, but the pressures are not as bad as they could have been 6 months ago, I think, as a result of these budgetary announcements. I think on the economy, I think that's a $60,000 question, or perhaps a lot larger amount of money than that. I mean, this is what policymakers globally are struggling with in terms of how to respond to such an unprecedented economic dip. And the good thing that happened in most countries most developed countries that could afford to do these schemes is very significant deficit spending to get us through the pandemic, things like the furlough scheme and grants to businesses to keep them afloat. I mean, this is what has left us in a stronger position at the end of not the end of the pandemic, but the end of the first stage, if you like, of the pandemic, where we are now. It's left us in a position where employment is better than we thought it might be, because we've used government spending to get us through the crisis. So I think in the long run, we're still way too early to evaluate the long-term impact of this, because the government has again rode to the rescue of the market, but in a way that they absolutely should have done, an international effort to keep us in the least worst position that we could be financially at this point after the start of the pandemic.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to both of you coming on to talk to us today. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find you on Twitter? Ed?
At Wales Governance is our organisation's Twitter. I'm also at Ed Gareth Poole.
Guto?
At Guto_Ifan.
Wonderful. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much for coming on. If you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please do not forget to find us on Medium at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, on Facebook at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, and on Twitter at Hiraeth Blog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.